The film opens with a child named Rick, who is caring for his ailing mother. When he brings her food and medicine, she, already feeling immense suffering, decides to end her life in front of Rick. Before doing so, she prays for forgiveness of her sins. 3 years later, we see Rick heading to a wealthy person's house to do some work. Upon arriving late, his boss almost sends him home, but luckily one of his co-workers named Jeremy speaks up for him, pointing out that they're short on manpower. In the end, Rick is allowed to stay and work. While working, Rick accidentally injures his abdomen. Noticing that one of the homeowner's right-hand woman is nearby, Rick asks for medicine. Because the medication is inside the house, the right-hand woman gives Rick permission to enter and treat his wound. For some reason, the right-hand woman leaves Rick alone, and while Rick is about to step out, he inadvertently spots a room containing stacks of $100 bills. Tempted, Rick takes just one note. But it turns out the homeowner is already there. Moments later, the right-hand woman appears, and without further ado, fires Rick on the spot. While the two are talking, the homeowner intervenes, calms the situation, and asks Rick to sit down. Here we learn the homeowner's name, Drayton. He questions Rick about why he took only one bill. Rick explains he was robbed on his way there and now desperately needs money for fare home. He took only one note because he planned to return it once he received his paycheck. Hearing this, Drayton chooses not to fire Rick, and instead gives him the entire stack of money. It turns out Rick is currently staying at Jeremy's apartment. They're not just co-workers, but also longtime friends. One evening, they talk about what they would do if they had a lot of money. The next day, Rick is summoned by Drayton for an important discussion. Drayton begins by asking Rick's name again, then confesses he doesn't have long to live and owns considerable wealth with no heirs, no children or grandchildren. Suddenly, Drayton makes a shocking statement. If Rick agrees to eat his corpse, all his wealth will be bequeathed to Rick, his house, money, cars, and more. Everything will belong to Rick if he is willing to eat Drayton's body. But actually, what Drayton means is that Rick only needs to eat the food placed on top of his corpse, rather than devouring the body itself. Rick is puzzled, but Drayton insists the offer is serious. By eating this single meal, Rick will have it all. Although Drayton explains at length, Rick still can't give a definitive answer. Later that night at a party, Rick meets his ex-girlfriend, Tanya. Since his mother's death, Rick and Tanya haven't been in touch much. They chat privately for a while, but then Jeremy gets into a small fight, and Rick steps in to break it up. Upset, Jeremy accuses Rick of not defending him, bringing up how he's let Rick stay in his apartment all this time. The following day, it turns out they have finished working at the wealthy family's house, and since Rick is unemployed, Jeremy offers him a job. Actually, the task could have been handled by Jeremy alone, but because Rick needs the money, they agree to split the earnings. Suddenly, there's a knock at the door. When they check, it's one of Drayton's men who says that Drayton has died. As mentioned before, all of Drayton's assets will go to Rick if he's willing to consume the meal on Drayton's body. Rick puts on the clothes provided, while Jeremy is left confused by the whole situation. Upon arrival, Drayton's right-hand woman clarifies that these proceedings must remain secret. Otherwise, Rick will lose everything. All Rick has to do is eat all the food served on top of Drayton's body. No leftovers. If anything is left, the deal is off. Though hesitant, Rick is persuaded when the right-hand woman mentions that afterward. Rick could even buy his own island if he wanted. Ultimately, Rick agrees, and the ceremony begins. They arrange food on Drayton's body, and Rick's sole task is to eat it all. Despite how unappealing it looks, Rick manages to consume everything. There's one final step, which is relatively simple: reading a passage written by Drayton. After that, feeling woozy, Rick rushes to throw up, then flops onto a bed. While trying to sleep, Rick is confronted by disturbing visions, seeing multiple dead people haunting him in a dream. When he wakes up, Rick wanders around his new house. He briefly meets an assistant who eyes him suspiciously, and Rick asks the right-hand woman about it. The right-hand woman replies there's no issue, as Rick is now the new master. He asks Rick what he plans to do, but Rick doesn't know, so the right-hand woman suggests redecorating to Rick's taste. Rick agrees. Before departing, the right-hand woman hands him Drayton's old black card, containing unlimited funds. Rick can buy anything with it. Meanwhile, at Jeremy's place, Jeremy is taken aback when Rick appears. Previously, Rick had told Jeremy about Drayton's inheritance job, but only vaguely, saying he'd been offered some work. Now Rick announces that the job is done, and that he'll no longer be living at Jeremy's apartment. Before leaving, Rick thanks Jeremy for everything he's done and offers him some money, which Jeremy refuses, saying he did it all for friendship. On his way to the car, Rick happens to meet Tanya. Feeling that his life is about to improve, he invites Tanya out for a drink, implying he wants to rekindle their relationship. However, Tanya says her feelings have changed. She declines and goes to see Jeremy instead. In the end, Rick drinks alone. At the bar, he asks for the most expensive liquor. A customer looks down on him, but Rick quickly shuts that down by ordering the costly drink outright. Back at the luxury residence, Rick experiences something strange. His nose suddenly bleeds, and shortly afterward a woman appears, harassing him. It's unclear whether it's real or imagined, but Rick awakens drenched. Startled, he questions the right-hand woman about what is happening, and finally learns the truth. What Rick did was actually a sin transfer ritual, a practice that's existed for a very long time. All the sins are passed on to whoever becomes the heir. Although there's immense wealth, there's also an enormous burden of sin. The ghosts tormenting Rick in his dreams are the victims wronged by the previous sin-bearer. Now Rick will be haunted by these restless spirits. The only way to free himself would be to do exactly what Drayton did. Find someone else to consume his sins. But of course, that would require Rick to die, just like Drayton did. After hearing it all, Rick decides to go to a church to seek forgiveness for his sins. Once there, the priest asks him to confess what sins he's committed. But Rick doesn't know. So the confession doesn't go through, and Rick returns to search for details of what the previous sin-bearer did. Initially, the right-hand woman refuses to reveal more, but relents when Rick threatens to fire her. It turns out the female apparition haunting Rick is Drayton's wife. Enraged that she had been unfaithful, Drayton strangled her to death. Using this story, Rick attempts to have those sins forgiven. Feeling relieved from that particular guilt, Rick heads home, and thankfully Drayton's wife's ghost no longer torments him. The next day, Tanya contacts Rick, saying Jeremy has been acting strangely. He has some serious issues but refuses to discuss them. Since Rick is his best friend, Tanya hopes he can figure out what's going on. Later, while Rick is watching a movie, he still can't find peace. Again and again, malevolent spirits appear, disturbing him. Eventually, he decides to visit the priest at night, seeking forgiveness once more. But the timing isn't right, and the priest asks him to come back another time. As usual, Rick continues to be plagued by ghosts. He fights it with medication, but taking too many pills causes him to lose consciousness. A doctor revives him, explaining that Rick was clinically dead for a few minutes. Realizing this, Rick devises a plan to rid himself of the curse, though it's unclear how. His biggest obstacle is finding someone who can replace him. The right-hand woman suggests Jeremy. However, Rick refuses because Jeremy is a dear friend. Then, out of the blue, Jeremy calls Rick asking for help. He needs cash fast and promises to repay it next week. He's being threatened by some dangerous people. Even in his groggy state, Rick agrees. When Rick arrives at Jeremy's place, he doesn't find Jeremy, just a ransacked apartment. Worried, Rick grabs Jeremy's firearm for protection. Suddenly, he encounters a stranger begging for help. Without knowing why, Rick impulsively shoots the stranger in the chest. Snapping out of his daze, Rick realizes he has just shot Tanya. Rick is taken back to the mansion, where the right-hand woman advises leaving the matter to them. Shortly after, Jeremy shows up, claiming the people who threatened him have killed Tanya. He has no idea that Rick was the one who actually fired the shot. Jeremy promises to leave his old life behind and pleads for Rick's help in finding legitimate work. Anything as long as it's honest. Right then, the right-hand woman offers a proposition. Jeremy can inherit Rick's sins in exchange for all the wealth Rick now possesses. Feeling overwhelmed, Rick finally decides on Jeremy, as the right-hand woman believes Jeremy is capable of bearing the burden, especially since he's a former soldier. Though puzzled, Jeremy agrees, as long as it pays well. The ritual is prepared. Rick's plan is to make himself clinically dead for a short time, so that once Jeremy completes the consumption rite, Rick can come back to life. The rule states that the one transferring the sins must die, so Rick arranges to die only for about 4 minutes, just long enough for Jeremy to finish eating. They carry out the ritual. While Jeremy eats, Rick, in his near-death state, meets his mother in a vision. After 4 minutes, the ritual succeeds, and Rick is revived. Now their fortunes are reversed. Rick goes back to living simply, while Jeremy becomes wealthy, but also suffers, just as Rick did before. In the final scene, we see the right-hand woman listening to Jeremy's tortured screams. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Rick sits alone until suddenly Tanya's spirit appears, keeping him company. And with that, the film ends. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. Because by subscribing you have supported me to make better videos. See you in the next video.